Reason and Revolution by Herbert Marcuse. Part 2, The Rise of Social Theory, Chapter 2.5, The Foundations of Positivism and the Rise of Sociology, The Transformation of the Dialectic into Sociology, Lawrence von Steen. There still remains for consideration the important influence exerted by the Hegelian philosophy on the social theory of Lawrence von Steen. Steen's works were well known to Marx and Engels and received criticism in their writings prior to the Communist Manifesto. Some controversy has arisen as to whether and how far they took over Steen's conceptions in their own theory. This problem does not interest us here, however, for the question seems irrelevant in view of the fact that the structure and aims of the Marxian theory are quite different from those of Steen's sociology. The influence of Steen's work on the development of social theory was slight. He was deemed a historian of the French Revolution and of French social theories, rather than a theoretician. The first edition of his Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs, published in 1842, gives a little indication of his sociological concepts. The edition of 1850, however, published in 3 volumes under the title, it's just a very long German title, gives full elaboration of these. The long introduction treats the concept of society and the laws of social movement. It represents the first German sociology. We are here using the term sociology in its exact sense, to designate the treatment of social theory as a special science, with a subject matter, conceptual framework, and method of its own. Social theory is taken as the science of society, investigating the particularly social relations among men and the laws or tendencies operating in these. This implies that such social relations can be distinguished from physical, economic, political, or religious ones, though in reality they might never occur without these. Sociology as a special science, though concerned with the general study of society, gives over a great number of social problems to other specialized sciences for treatment. Thus, problems such as the production and distribution of wealth, the tariff in international trade and investment are handled by economics. Other groups of social problems are turned over to other special sciences, for example, to political science and education, and above all, sociology is severed from any connection with philosophy. The emancipation of sociology from philosophy must not be confused with the negation and realization of philosophy as it occurs in Marxian social theory. Sociology does not negate philosophy in the sense of taking over the hidden content of philosophy and carrying it into social theory and practice, but sets itself up as a realm apart from philosophy with a province and truth of its own. Comte is rightly held to be the inaugurator of this separation between philosophy and sociology. It is true that Comte and other thinkers in the same tradition made a formal equation between their social theory and philosophy. Thus, John Stuart Mill outlined his logic of social science within a comprehensive general logic, and Spencer made the principles of sociology part of his system of synthetic philosophy. But these thinkers changed the meaning of philosophy to make it quite different from the philosophy that originally gave birth to social theory. Philosophy to these men was merely a synopsis of the fundamental concepts and principles employed in the specialized sciences, with Comte mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and sociology, with Spencer biology, psychology, sociology, and morals. The synoptic study of these sciences was philosophical by virtue of its general positivistic character, as refutation of all transcendental ideas. Such philosophy thus amounted to the refutation of philosophy. The anti-philosophical bent of sociology is of great significance. We have seen that, with Comte, society became the subject matter of an independent field of investigation. The social relations and the laws governing them were no longer derived, as they have been in Hegel's system, from the essence of the individual, still less were they analyzed according to such standards as reason, freedom, and right. The latter now appeared unscientific. Sociological method was oriented to describing observable facts and to establishing empirical generalities about them. In contrast to the dialectical conception, which viewed the world as a negative totality and was therefore intrinsically critical, the sociological method was intrinsically neutral, viewing society in the same way physics viewed nature. Ever since Comte, sociology has been patterned on the natural sciences. It has been held as science precisely insofar as its subject matter was amenable to the same neutral treatment as that of the exact sciences. John Stuart Mill's characterization of the science of society remains typical for its subsequent development. Mill said, "The science stands in the same relation to the social as anatomy and physiology to the physical body. It shows by what principles of its nature man is induced to enter into a state of society, how this feature of his position acts upon his interests and feelings, and through them upon his conduct, how the association tends progressively to become closer, and the cooperation extends itself to more and more purposes, what those purposes are, and what the varieties of means most generally adopted for furthering them, what are the various relations which establish themselves among men as the ordinary consequence of the social union, what those which are different in different states of society, and what are the effects of each upon the conduct and character of man." According to this description, the science of society is, in principle, not to be distinguished from natural science. Social phenomena are exact to a lesser degree and more difficult to classify than natural phenomena, but they can be subjected to the standard of exactness and to the principles of generalization and classification. For this reason, the theory of society is a real science. Sociology, moreover, has this in common with the other exact sciences. It proceeds from accumulating facts to classifying them successfully. This is the principle of its procedure. All knowledge that is not systematized according to this principle must be ruled out of the science of society. The very principles, however, that make sociology a special science set it at odds with the dialectical theory of society. In the latter, generalization and classification of facts was at best an irrelevant undertaking. How could such procedure have any bearing on the truth, when all facts were regarded as constituted by the unique structure and movement of the social whole, in which the changing directions of human character throughout history played an essential part? The dialectical theory of society emphasized the essential potentialities and contradictions within this social whole, thereby stressing what could be done with society and also exposing the inadequacy of its actual form. Scientific neutrality was incompatible with the nature of the subject matter and with the directions for human practice derived from an analysis of it. Furthermore, the dialectical social theory could not be a special science among other sciences, because it considered the social relations to embrace and condition all spheres of thought and existence. Society is the negative totality of all given human relations, including relations to nature, and not any part of these. For these reasons, the dialectic was a philosophical and not a sociological method, one in which every single dialectical notion held all of the negative totality and thus conflicted with any cutting off of a social realm of social relations. Any attempt at sociology first had to refute the dialectical claim as Stahl did, or to detach it from its philosophical ground as did von Steen, who transformed dialectical laws and concepts into sociological ones. Von Steen called his work the first attempt to set up the concept of society as an independent concept and to develop its content. Hegel's philosophy of right had exposed the destructive antagonisms within civil society as inevitable products of this social order. To be sure, the Hegelian emphasis weakened the force of the social contradiction by interpreting them as ontological ones. Nevertheless, Hegel's dialectic had set up no inexorable natural law of history, but it quite clearly indicated that the path of man's historical practice lay in the direction of freedom. The dialectical movement of civil society in the work of von Steen appears much more as the movement of things, capital, property, labor, than as the movement of men. Social development is governed by natural laws rather than by human practice. Von Steen regards this state of affairs not as the product of capitalist reifications, but as the natural state of modern society. Reification is understood as a universal law with which social theory and practice need perforce comply. The dialectic becomes part of an objective and impartial study of society. Owing to the circumstances in which von Steen's work originated, however, these neutralizing tendencies were considerably counteracted. Steen was, after all, guided by his study of social struggles in post-revolutionary France and paid close attention to French social critics and theorists of the period. This concrete historical approach induced him to say that the economic process was basic to the social and political process, and that the class struggles were the true pivotal content of society. He saw and admitted for a time that the irreconcilable contradictions of modern society were the motor of its development, thus aligning himself with Hegel's dialectical analysis of society. But this focusing upon the antagonisms within the economic process had to be abandoned if sociology was to be secure as an objective science. Hence, von Steen himself renounced his own earlier position. As early as 1852, he forswore the attempt to base social theory on political economy. It is well known that the entire science of society originated from a study of the economic antagonism that exploitation and competition have induced between the Fourth Estate especially, or labor shorn of capital, and the owners of capital. This fact has led to a conclusion which, evident as it seemed, necessarily brought great jeopardy to the deeper foundations of this science. The author of these lines cannot deny that he himself contributed greatly to the acceptance of this conclusion, for he assumed that, since the present form of society is essentially conditioned by the economic relations, the social order as such could not be other than a print, as it were, of the economic order. From this opinion, then, followed the other, that the entire movement of society is also exclusively governed by these laws, which determine economic life in such a manner that the whole science of society is eventually reduced to a mere reflex of the economic laws and developments. The statement professes that establishing sociology as a real science requires the abolition of its economic foundation. Steen's sociology henceforth set out to uphold social harmony in the face of the economic contradictions and morality in the face of social struggles. In 1856, Steen published his Gesellschaftslehre. Sure. The first book began the construction of a social ethics, and the last concluded with the principles of social harmony, showing that the various orders of society and its classes are linked together so that they supplement and fulfill one another. In place of dealing with von Steen's final system of sociology, we shall limit ourselves to a brief summary of the foundations of his sociology as expounded in the introduction to the Geschichte der Sozialen Bewegung in Frankreich. I'm so sorry. The preface to the edition of 1850 advances the assumption basic to the new science of society, that social dynamic is governed by a necessary law which it is sociology's task to discover. This law, Steen says, can be expressed in its most general form as the struggle of the ruling class to obtain full possession of state power and to exclude the other class from possessing such. The social process consists at root in the class war between capital and labor for state control. The antagonism between state and society is the basic idea of Steen's sociology. The two materialize two entirely different principles. Society is the organic unity of human life as conditioned by the distribution of wealth, regulated by the organism of labor, moved by the system of wants, and joined to succeeding generations by the family and its right. We can recognize Hegel in this definition, as well as the early French socialists. Steen clothes the skeleton conception that he took over from Hegel with the material got from the French critical analysis of modern society. In essence, society is class society. The general and inalterable relation in society is that between a dominant and a dependent class. The existence of classes is an inevitably given fact, originating in the process of labor. Those who possess the material of labor as property herewith possess what those who have no property need in order to acquire it. In the utilization of their labor power, the latter are dependent on this prerequisite, namely the material of labor, and since this material is property which cannot be worked on without the consent of the proprietors, it follows that all who possess nothing but labor power are dependent on those who possess property. The social order is thus necessarily a class order. Its prime feature is self-seeking, a general penchant of each to acquire the means for his own independence and the means for making others dependent. In contrast to society, the state is the community of all individual wills elevated to a personal union. The principle of the state is the development, progress, wealth, power, and intelligence of all individuals without distinction, positing all individuals as free and equal. The state preserves the common interest, reason, and freedom from the conflicting private interests of society. Of utmost significance for the evolution of sociology is the manner in which Steen's separation of state and society disposes of the actual problem of modern social theory. In the first place, class antagonism is declared to be the general unalterable law of society and accepted as an inevitable fact. Despite the retention of Hegelian terminology, Steen succumbs to the positivist affirmative tendencies of early sociology. Secondly, he neutralizes the basic contradictions of modern society by distributing them between two different domains, those of state and society. Freedom and equality are reserved to the state, which exploitation and inequality are delegated to the society, thus turning the inherent contradiction of society into an antagonism between state and society. Modern society is released from any obligation to fulfill human freedom. The responsibility belongs to the state. The state, on the other hand, exists only as the prize of the classes in struggle and is incapable of withstanding the power and the claims of society. The solution of the social antagonisms thus seems to revert to society again. Steen declares that the process of enslavement and of liberation is in entirety a social process, and that bondage and freedom are sociological concepts. Liberty means social independence, or the ownership of sufficient means to enable one to fix the conditions of another's labor. Liberty is necessarily connected with bondage. Society is a class order and hence incompatible with freedom. Steen is thus faced with the following problem. The state is the true field of realization of human community, but it is impotent before class society. The latter, the actual field in which men fulfill themselves, cannot be free, owing to its principle. The possibility of progress, therefore, must be sought in a factor that stands above state and society and is more powerful than both. This ultimate factor, Steen decides, is the personality and its destiny. The personality is more powerful than state or society. It is the foundation and springboard for the development to freedom. This conception marks Steen's volte-face from the economic foundations of social theory and its achievements. He comes out with an idealist ethics. Not only is society unfree in its very principle, discharged from the responsibility for freedom, but the state, which inevitably must come under the sway of society, is similarly discharged. The process of transforming philosophical into sociological concepts finally yields man's historical existence to the inalterable mechanisms of the social process and reserves his destiny and goal to his moral personality. The coast is clear for treating social problems in the manner of wort-frei science. We have seen that Steen views the social process as a struggle between state and society, or as a struggle on the part of the ruling social class for state power. The state's principle is to elevate all individuals to perfect freedom. The principle of the society to subjugate some individuals to others. History is in reality the constant renewal of this conflict on different levels, and the progress of history takes place through the changes in social structure that result. Steen proceeds to establish the natural laws of this change. We have already mentioned the first law, that the ruling class strives to make possession of state power as exclusively its own as it can. As soon as this goal is reached, a new dynamic begins, consisting in attempts to use the state power in the positive interest of the ruling class. There are different historic stages of this use and consequently different degrees of social domination or bondage. The first stage is characterized by absolute triumph of society over the state, or the complete identification of the ruling class with the idea of the state. Steen calls this absolute society. It begins with class appropriation of the means of labor and is accompanied by an increasing subjugation of the class deprived of these means. Hence, the development of all social order is a movement toward bondage. Just as the class structure of society is necessarily the source of bondage, it is also as much the source of a development in the direction of freedom. The process sets in wherever the capitalist class has completed its organization of society in its own interest. We know that freedom is a social concept, dependent on the acquisition of those goods required for the individual's growth. It follows that the subject class will strain towards getting possession of the wherewithal to gratify its cultural as well as material wants. This class will demand 1, general and equal education, and 2, material freedom, that is, the opportunity to acquire property. The latter demand will conflict with the interest of the established order, the vested interest of the ruling class. In the last analysis, the possessor class aims to satisfy its wants and desires without labor. The possessor class, then, is a non-laboring class, and the opposition between property and lack of property is really one between unearned income and labor. Since labor alone makes property a right and a value, and since unearned income is a dead weight that cannot resist the onslaught of labor, it follows that the working class will increasingly become the master of all value. That is, will increasingly acquire property and the means of production, and finally take over the place of the former non-laboring class. When this occurs, the legal and political structures which have been modeled on the interests of a non-laboring ruling class will openly conflict with the actual new power relations and controls in society. Transformation of the established system of right becomes an intrinsic, soon also an extrinsic necessity. Two kinds of transformation are possible: political reform and revolution. In the first case, state power would have to yield to the demands of the dependent class and sanction the fact of social equality by recognizing legal equality. The major changes in history, however, have all been effected by revolution. The upper class does not grant the demand of the lower class, nor does it allow for a legal reorganization that would conform to the new distribution of social wealth. Revolution under such conditions is inevitable. Steen places heavy stress on the fact that revolution contains in its principle a contradiction that at once determines the course it will take. Every revolution proclaims general equality for the whole class, hitherto excluded from power, but it actually establishes equal right only for that part of the class that has already got possession of economic wealth. When the class is victorious in its revolution, then it splits into two conflicting strata. No revolutionary movement is able to avert this contradiction. According to its inalterable nature, every revolution uses a social class whose interest it will not and cannot serve. Every revolution, as soon as it is complete, thus encounters an enemy in the person of the very mass that helped achieve the result. In other words, every revolution issues into a new class conflict and a new form of class society. The privileges of unearned income are abolished, and property based upon labor becomes the foundation of the new social order. But this same property in the form of capital soon stands against the potential of acquisition, labor power. The earning power of capital comes to oppose capitalless labor. Although this condition seems perfectly harmonious and an adequate result of the process of free acquisition, it turns out to be the fountain of a new form of bondage, for in reality, labor is excluded from acquiring capital. The social position of the capitalist is a function of the aggregate of his capital. The growth of capital depends on the value of the product over and above its production cost. The competition of capitals requires a struggle for lower production costs and thus leads necessarily to constant pressure on wages. This is of the essence of capital. The interest of capital conflicts with the interest of labor. The original harmony is dissolved into contradiction. Steen emphasized that the mechanisms of the revolution operate in the form of unalterable natural laws, that moral indignation or similar evaluations are hence entirely out of place. Moreover, Steen knows that the contradictions he has just analyzed are distinctive of a society based on free labor and acquisition, and that the same may not be applied to other forms of social organization. It is precisely the activity of property owners that, taking the form of competition, renders it impossible for those who do not possess property to acquire it. He goes one step further to declare that the proletariat will need its own revolution to overthrow this society. The proletariat is the class that the middle class revolution has deprived of all acquisitive power. Little wonder, then, that it claims the right to seize that power and to reorganize society on the pattern of real social equality. This proletarian act would constitute the social revolution as distinguished from all preceding revolutions, which were political revolutions. At this point, Steen's sociology veers from its dialectical direction and follows the ideas of positive sociology. The proletarian revolution would be a disaster, and the victory of proletariat the triumph of bondage. The reason is that the proletariat is not the stronger or the better part of the social whole. Moreover, it lacks the right to seize the state because it does not possess the material and intellectual goods which are prerequisite for true supremacy. The idea of proletarian rule is, therefore, a contradiction in itself. The proletariat is incapable of maintaining any such supremacy. The old ruling class will soon take revenge upon it and clamp down a dictatorship of violence. The successful revolution always leads to dictatorship, and this dictatorship, setting itself above society, proclaims itself an independent state power and takes the right mantle and halo of such. This is the end of social revolution. But is it likewise the end of social process? The personality exalted to the position of the decisive factor in social development has prepared Steen's sudden departure from critical analysis. The acquisitive society preserves personality, for it establishes the principle that free personal development demands the universal opportunity to earn. If the opportunity has been restricted in the actual course capitalism took, it may still be restored by proper social reform. In modern acquisitive society, capital expresses man's mastery over his external life. The quality of personal freedom here is therefore to be found in the fact that the most inferior grade of labor power is able to get possession of capital. Also, Steen recalls his critical analysis of the contradictions inherent in middle-class society. He asks whether it is at all possible in an acquisitive society so to organize the labor process that work alone achieves a possession corresponding to its amount and kind. The answer he gives is affirmative, resting on an appeal to man's true interest. Man requires freedom and will have it. It is particularly in the interest of the possessing class to work for social reform through all social forces and with the aid of the state and its power. Lorenz von Steen thus turned the dialectic into an ensemble of objective laws, calling for social reform as the adequate solution of all contradictions, and neutralized the critical element of the dialectic.